She was left for dead in the woods, the cowboy said. You're not dying alone tonight. In the frozen darkness of Montana Territory, 1878, a young woman's desperate crawl through blood-stained pine needles should have been her last moments on earth. But fate had other plans when a stranger's voice cut through her dying breath. This is a story of survival, vengeance, and a love forged in violence. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Clara Whitmore noticed when she regained consciousness was the taste of copper in her mouth. Blood. Her own blood, thick and warm, coating her tongue and teeth. The second thing she noticed was the cold. A bone-deep Montana winter cold that seeped through her torn dress and into her very marrow. The third thing, the thing that made her stomach clench with primal terror, was the silence. It was the kind of silence that only comes to a forest after violence has passed through it. Clara's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment she couldn't understand what she was seeing. Pine branches, dark sky, stars that seemed impossibly bright, cold pinpricks of light that offered no warmth, no comfort. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain exploded through her ribs, white hot and all-consuming. A sound escaped her lips, half moan, half sob, and she tasted blood again. Get up, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible. Get up, Clara. Get up. But her body wouldn't obey. It felt distant, disconnected, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. She managed to lift her head an inch, maybe two, and that's when the memories came flooding back with brutal clarity. The mine. Her father's mine. 3 men with hard eyes and harder hands. Doyle's fist connecting with her jaw. Phelps holding her arms. Riker's boot in her ribs again and again until she couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but pray for it to end. Should we finish her? Phelps had asked, his voice casual, as if he were asking about the weather. Doyle had spit tobacco juice onto the ground near her face. Nah, let the cold do it. Clean her that way. No one will find her till spring, and by then there won't be enough left to identify. They'd laughed. She remembered that most clearly, the sound of their laughter fading as they'd ridden away, leaving her broken and bleeding on the forest floor like a piece of trash they'd discarded. That had been, how long ago? An hour? 2? The light had been different then. She was sure of it. Late afternoon sun filtering through the trees. Now it was full dark, and the temperature had dropped even further. She could see her breath forming small clouds in the air above her face. Clara tried again to move, this time managing to roll onto her side. The movement sent fresh waves of agony through her body, and she had to bite down on her lip to keep from crying out. Slowly, painfully, she brought her hands up to her face. Her fingers were numb, barely responsive, but she could feel the swelling around her left eye, the split in her lip, the sticky warmth of blood matting her hair. She had to move, had to get somewhere, anywhere. If she stayed here, Doyle had been right. The cold would finish what they'd started. Using her arms, Clara began to drag herself forward. It was pathetic, really. She'd managed maybe 3 feet when she'd been thrown from a horse as a girl and broken her ankle, and she'd still walked nearly a mile home. Now, beaten and broken, she could barely manage 3 feet. But 3 feet was better than nothing. 3 feet was survival, even if it was just for a few more minutes. The forest floor was unforgiving. Rocks bit into her palms. Fallen branches caught at her dress, tearing the already ruined fabric further. Pine needles stuck to the blood on her face and hands. But Clara kept moving, one agonizing inch at a time, driven by something deeper than logic or hope. It was pure animal instinct, the same instinct that made wounded creatures crawl into the darkness to either heal or die in peace. She didn't know where she was going. Deeper into the woods, away from the trail where they'd ambushed her. That was all. Just away. Maybe she'd find a hollow tree, someplace to curl up and wait for... What? Rescue? That was a fool's dream. No one knew where she was. No one would come looking. Her father was dead, had been for 3 months now. His friends, the few who'd known him, had scattered after the claim jumped into legal limbo. She'd come to Montana alone, determined to prove her right to the mine he'd worked until his dying breath. And look where that determination had gotten her. A branch snapped somewhere behind her. Clara froze, every muscle in her body tensing despite the pain. Her heart, which had been beating sluggishly, suddenly hammered against her broken ribs. She held her breath, listening, Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Coming closer. They'd come back. The thought cut through her mind with crystal clarity. They'd come back to make sure she was dead, and this time they'd finish the job properly. Claire's fingers scrabbled at the forest floor, searching for something, anything, a rock, a branch, some kind of weapon. Her hand closed around a piece of deadwood about as thick as her wrist. It wasn't much, but it was something. The footsteps came closer still, and now she could hear breathing, the soft rustle of movement through undergrowth. Clara gripped her pathetic weapon tighter and tried to push herself up into something resembling a defensive position. She made it to her knees, swaying dangerously, before her vision started to gray at the edges. "Not yet," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Not yet, damn you." A shadow detached itself from the darkness between the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered. Clara raised her branch with shaking arms, prepared to go down fighting even if this was her last act on Earth. "Easy now." The voice was male, deep and calm, with the kind of roughness that came from years of hard living. It wasn't one of her attackers. She was certain of that. The tone was wrong. Too gentle. Too careful. "Stay back," Clara managed to say, though the words came out as barely more than a whisper. "I'm warning you." The shadow stopped moving. She heard the creak of leather, the soft jingle of spurs, and then a match flared in the darkness. By its flickering light, Clara saw him clearly for the first time. He was tall, probably 6 foot or more, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build evident even beneath his heavy coat. His face was weathered, marked by sun and wind and time, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray-blue, like a winter sky, and filled with something that looked almost like concern as they took in her condition. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, holding the match steady so she could see his face. "My name's Elias Boone. I heard sounds of trouble a ways back. Been tracking whoever did this to you." Clara wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly, but trust had nearly gotten her killed today, and she wasn't about to make that mistake again. "Likely story," she said, her voice shaking. "Why should I believe you?" The match burned down to Elias's fingers, and he shook it out. For a moment, there was only darkness again. Then she heard him moving, the soft sound of his boots on the forest floor as he came closer. "Because if I meant you harm, ma'am, I wouldn't have announced myself. And I sure as hell wouldn't be standing here talking when I could have done whatever I wanted while you were unconscious." The logic was sound, Clara had to admit, but logic and trust were two different things. Still, her arms were shaking so badly she could barely hold up her branch anymore, and the cold was settling deeper into her bones with each passing second. "What do you want?" she asked. "To help you," Elias said simply. "To get you somewhere warm and tend those wounds before you bleed out or freeze to death, preferably both." He struck another match, and this time Clara got a better look at him. His clothes were worn but well maintained, a sign of a man who took care of what he had. His gun belt sat low on his hips, the revolver holstered there showing signs of use but also careful maintenance. But it was his face that told her the most. There were lines there, deep ones, carved by hardship and loss. This was a man who'd seen violence, who'd known suffering, and maybe, just maybe, that meant he'd recognize it in others. "They left me for dead," Clara heard herself say. 3 men. They wanted my father's mine claim." Something flickered across Elias's face, anger, quick and hot, before he controlled it. "They do this to you?" Clara nodded, then immediately regretted it as the movement sent her head spinning. "Can you tell me your name?" Elias asked, his voice still calm, still gentle. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara Whitmore." "Well, Miss Whitmore, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to come a little closer, and I'm going to help you onto my horse. Then we're going to ride to my cabin. It's about an hour from here, and I'm going to do what I can for those injuries. You can keep that stick if it makes you feel safer, but I promise you, you won't need it." Clara studied him for a long moment, trying to read his face in the flickering matchlight. She'd always prided herself on being a good judge of character. Her father had taught her that, and everything she saw in Elias Boone told her he was telling the truth. Or maybe she was just desperate enough to believe anyone who offered help. The match burned out again, and this time Clara let her makeshift weapon drop to the ground. "All right," she said softly. "All right, Mr. Boone." She heard him move closer, felt his presence more than saw it in the darkness. Then his hands were on her arms, steady and warm through her torn sleeves, and he was helping her to her feet with surprising gentleness for a man his size. "Easy does it," he murmured as Clara swayed against him. "I've got you. Just lean on me." Clara had no choice but to obey. Her legs barely supported her weight, and without Elias's solid presence beside her, she would have collapsed immediately. He kept one arm around her waist, supporting most of her weight as he guided her through the darkness. "Horse is just ahead," he said. "Think you can manage the ride?" "I don't have much choice, do I?" Clara managed a weak attempt at humor. She felt rather than saw his slight smile. "That's the spirit, Miss Whitmore." His horse was a big bay gelding with kind eyes that reflected the starlight. The animal stood perfectly still as Elias carefully lifted Clara into the saddle. The movement sent fresh pain lancing through her ribs, and she couldn't quite suppress her gasp. "Sorry," Elias said quietly. "I know it hurts. Just hold on." He swung up behind her with easy grace, settling her against his chest so she could lean back against his solid warmth. One arm came around her waist to hold her steady, while his other hand gathered the reins. "You're not dying alone tonight," Elias said, his voice low and firm, like he was making a vow. "That's a promise, Miss Whitmore." And then they were moving, the horse's steady gait carrying them through the dark forest. Clara closed her eyes, letting herself lean fully against Elias's chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, feel his breathing, the rise and fall of his chest against her back. It was strangely comforting, being held like this, safe and warm despite everything that had happened. She must have drifted in and out of consciousness during the ride, because the next thing she knew clearly, they were in a clearing. A small cabin sat dark against the night sky, solid and squared and real. Elias reined in the horse and dismounted with careful movements, then reached up to lift Clara down. "Almost there," he told her as he carried her toward the cabin door. "Just hang on a little longer." The cabin was a single room, Clara realized, as Elias kicked the door open and carried her inside. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner. Simple, sparse, but clean. The home of a man who lived alone and didn't need much. Elias laid her carefully on the bed, then moved to the fireplace. Within minutes, he had a fire going, and warm light filled the cabin. Clara watched him move with efficient grace, lighting a lamp, pumping water into a basin, gathering supplies from various corners of the room. Medical supplies, she realized. Bandages, bottles of what looked like whiskey and carbolic acid, a needle and thread for stitching. "You've done this before," she observed, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias glanced at her as he set the basin of water on the bedside table. "More times than I care to remember." He pulled the single chair close to the bed and sat down, dipping a clean cloth into the water. "This is going to hurt," he warned, "but I need to clean these wounds before I can do anything else. You understand?" Clara nodded, bracing herself. But when Elias's hands touched her face, his movements were so gentle she barely felt them at first. Carefully, methodically, he began cleaning the blood from her skin, his expression concentrated and serious. "Tell me what happened," he said quietly as he worked. "Start from the beginning." So Clara told him about her father, Thomas Whitmore, who'd come west 5 years ago chasing the dream of gold, about how he'd actually found it, a decent claim up in the hills. Nothing huge, but enough to make a good life. About his death 3 months ago, sudden and unexpected, leaving Clara alone in Boston with nothing but debts and her father's last letter telling her about the mine. "I came to claim what was rightfully mine," she said, wincing as Elias cleaned a particularly deep cut on her temple. "The law said I had to prove my identity and my relationship to my father. It took weeks, but I finally got everything in order. I was supposed to file the paperwork in Helena tomorrow." "But someone didn't want that to happen," Elias said, his voice hard. 3 men, Doyle, Phelps, and Riker. They'd worked for my father, supposedly. They said they had a right to the claim since they'd been working it when he died. But I had the deed, the will, everything legal, so they... Her voice trailed off. "So they decided to take care of the problem permanently," Elias finished for her, anger making his jaw tight. Clara nodded weakly. They ambushed me on the trail about 5 miles from here. Beat me, took my papers, my horse, everything. Left me to die. Elias was silent for a long moment, his hands stilling in their work. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but filled with barely controlled fury. Those men made a mistake, Miss Whitmore. What mistake was that? Clara asked. They left you alive. There was something in his tone that made Clara look at him more carefully. In the lamplight, she could see his face clearly now, the strong features, the weathered skin, the eyes that had seen too much violence. But there was also something else there, a cold, controlled rage that told her Elias Boone was far more than just a helpful stranger. Who are you? She asked quietly. Really? Elias met her gaze steadily. Just a man who's tired of watching bad people get away with doing bad things. It wasn't a real answer, and they both knew it. But before Clara could press further, a wave of dizziness swept over her, and she had to close her eyes against the spinning sensation. Easy, Elias said, his hand gentle on her shoulder. Don't try to talk anymore. Let me finish this. Clara let herself drift as he continued his work. She was vaguely aware of him stitching the worst of her cuts, wrapping her ribs with strips of clean cloth, covering her with a heavy blanket. At some point, he lifted her head and held a cup to her lips. Drink this, he instructed. It's laudanum. Not much, just enough to help with the pain and let you sleep. The bitter liquid slid down her throat, and Clara grimaced. But within minutes, she felt the effects, a blessed numbness spreading through her body, dulling the sharp edges of pain to something more manageable. The bed's yours, Elias said quietly. I'll take the floor. You don't have to. Clara started to protest, but Elias cut her off with a gentle but firm shake of his head. Miss Whitmore, I've slept on worse than a wood floor, believe me. You need the rest more than I do. Don't argue. Clara wanted to argue anyway. It seemed wrong to take his bed, but exhaustion and laudanum were pulling her under. Her eyes drifted closed despite her best efforts to keep them open. Mr. Boone? She murmured. Yes, ma'am? Thank you. For everything. She felt his hand rest briefly on her shoulder, warm and reassuring. You're safe now, Miss Whitmore. That's all that matters. Sleep. And Clara did, falling into darkness that was blessedly free of pain, fear, or cold. For the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was. The ceiling above her was rough timber, unfamiliar, and the bed beneath her was narrower and harder than any she'd known. Then memory came flooding back with brutal clarity, and with it, pain. She groaned softly, trying to move, and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her ribs felt like they were wrapped in bands of fire. Her face throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and when she tried to open her left eye fully, she found it swollen, nearly shut. Easy there. Elias's voice came from somewhere to her right. Don't try to move too fast. You took a hell of a beating. Clara turned her head carefully and saw him sitting at the rough wooden table, a tin cup of coffee in his hands. Morning light streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating dust motes in the air and catching in his dark hair. He'd shaved since last night, she noticed, and changed into a clean shirt, but his eyes looked tired with dark circles beneath them that suggested he hadn't slept much. What time is it? Clara asked, her voice rough and scratchy. About 9 in the morning. You slept through most of the night and into the day. That's good. Your body needs rest to heal. He stood and crossed to the fireplace, where a coffee pot sat warming on the edge of the hearth. Think you could manage some coffee? Maybe some food? Clara's stomach churned at the thought of eating, but she knew she should try. Coffee sounds good. Elias poured a cup and brought it to her, helping her sit up enough to drink without spilling. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through her ribs, and Clara had to bite back a gasp. When she was finally propped against the wall with a pillow behind her back, Elias handed her the cup. Careful, it's hot, he warned. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was warm, and Clara felt it begin to chase away some of the lingering chill in her bones. She sipped it slowly, watching Elias over the rim of the cup as he returned to his chair at the table. Thank you, she said after a moment. For last night, for everything. Elias nodded, his expression unreadable. How are you feeling this morning? Be honest. Clara took stock of herself carefully. Like I was trampled by a horse and left for dead in the woods. A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's face. Fair enough, but nothing feels worse than last night? No fever, no new pains. Everything hurts, Clara admitted. But no, nothing worse, nothing new. That's good. Means infection hasn't set in yet, and hopefully won't if we keep those wounds clean. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those sharp gray-blue eyes. You're lucky, Miss Whitmore. Very lucky. Another hour or two in that cold, and I would have found a corpse instead of a survivor. Clara shuddered at the thought. I don't feel very lucky. No, I don't suppose you do, Elias said quietly. But you're alive, and that's more than those bastards intended. That counts for something. They sat in silence for a moment, Clara sipping her coffee while Elias seemed to be thinking about something. Finally, he leaned forward, his expression serious. We need to talk about what happens next, he said. Those men, Doyle, Phelps, and Riker, they think you're dead. That gives us an advantage, but only if we're smart about it. An advantage for what? Clara asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. For getting your claim back, for making sure they pay for what they did to you. Elias's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. You said you had papers, documents proving your right to that mine. Where are they now? They took them, Clara said bitterly. Everything. My father's will, the deed to the mine, my identification papers, letters from his lawyer. They took it all. But copies exist somewhere, don't they? Your father's lawyer would have them. Clara nodded slowly. Yes, Mr. Harrison in Boston. He handled everything for my father, but even with copies, without the originals and without me to present them. They can file their own claim and there's nothing to stop them, Elias finished. How long do you think it'll take them to do that? Clara thought about it, her mind working through the logistics despite the fog of pain and exhaustion. A few days at least. Maybe a week. They'll want to make sure that they think I'm really dead, and they'll need to manufacture some kind of documentation showing they have a right to the claim, which gives us time, Elias said. Time to heal, time to plan, time to gather evidence. Evidence of what? There's no proof they attacked me. No witnesses. Clara heard the defeat in her own voice and hated it. Elias stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the pine-covered hills beyond. Maybe not of the attack itself, but there's other things we can prove. That mine was your father's. That's a matter of public record. That you're his legal heir. We can get those documents from Boston. That these men have no legitimate claim to it, also provable. And if we're smart, if we're patient, we might be able to catch them in the act of filing false claims. Clara listened to him lay out the strategy, surprised by how methodical he was, how thoroughly he seemed to be thinking it through. This wasn't just a good Samaritan who'd helped an injured stranger. This was someone who knew how investigations worked, who understood the law and how to use it. You were a lawman, she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Elias turned from the window, his expression giving nothing away. What makes you say that? The way you think, the way you talk about evidence and building a case, the way you... Clara gestured vaguely, trying to find the right words. The way you carry yourself. You're not just some random cowboy who happened to find me. For a long moment, Elias didn't respond. He just stood there, silhouetted against the window, his face in shadow. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I was a deputy marshal. Long time ago. What happened? Clara asked, then immediately regretted the question when she saw his expression close off. I'm sorry, that's none of my business. No, it's all right. Elias came back to the table and sat down heavily, like a man carrying a great weight. You've got a right to know who's helping you. I was a marshal for 8 years, mostly in Kansas and Missouri after the war. Good at my job, too, or so they told me. Brought in a lot of bad men, put them in front of judges and juries. He paused, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, staring down into the dark liquid like he might find answers there. But the law has limits, Miss Whitmore. There's what's legal and what's just, and they're not always the same thing. I learned that the hard way. His voice turned bitter. There was a man, a rancher named Caldwell, who'd been terrorizing homesteaders in Kansas. burning them out, killing their livestock, running them off land they'd bought fair and square. Everyone knew he was doing it, but there was never any proof. No witnesses willing to testify. The territorial judge was in Caldwell's pocket, so nothing could be done, legally speaking. Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story. One of those homesteaders was a family I knew, Elias continued. Good people. Man and his wife and 3 children, youngest was only 4 years old. Caldwell's men came one night and set fire to their house. Whole family burned alive. My God, Clara whispered. I arrested Caldwell anyway. Brought him in. But without evidence, without witnesses, the judge let him walk. 2 weeks later, he was back at it, burning out another family. Elias's jaw tightened. That's when I realized the badge I wore didn't mean a damn thing if it couldn't protect innocent people. So I quit. And did what? Clara asked softly. Elias met her eyes, and what she saw there made her shiver. I handled it outside the law. Caldwell had an accident a month later, fell off his horse, broke his neck. Nobody could prove otherwise, and nobody looked too hard. The burning stopped. Clara should have been horrified, should have been afraid of this man who just admitted to taking justice into his own hands, to killing a man outside the law. But instead, she felt a strange sense of relief. Because Elias Boone understood something fundamental that she was only now beginning to grasp, that sometimes the law wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to fight back with every tool you had, legal or not. Why tell me this? She asked. Because if you want my help getting your claim back and making those men pay, you need to know who you're dealing with. I'm not a white knight, Miss Whitmore. I've done things that would horrify decent people, but I'm also a man who keeps his promises, and last night I promised you wouldn't die alone. I'm extending that promise now. You won't face this alone either, not if you don't want to. Clara looked at him for a long moment, this hard-edged man with kind eyes and blood on his conscience. She thought about her father, who'd always taught her to follow the rules, to trust in the law and in justice. But her father was dead, and the law had done nothing to protect her from 3 men who'd beaten her and left her to die in the cold. I want your help, she said firmly, whatever it takes. Elias nodded slowly. All right then. First thing we need to do is get you healed up enough to travel. That'll take time, at least a week, maybe 2, before you're strong enough. We use that time to plan, to figure out exactly what we need and how to get it. And then? Then we go to Helena. We expose Doyle, Phelps, and Riker for what they are. We get your claim back, and we make damn sure they pay for what they did to you. The certainty in his voice sent a thrill through Clara, despite her pain. For the first time since her father's death, since she'd come to this brutal territory alone and afraid, she felt like she wasn't fighting an impossible battle. She had an ally. A dangerous one, perhaps, but an ally nonetheless. Now, Elias said, standing, you need to eat something. I've got some salt pork and beans I can heat up, and some bread that's only a day old. Nothing fancy, but it'll give you strength. Clara's stomach growled despite her earlier nausea, and she realized she was actually hungry. When had she last eaten? Yesterday morning, before she'd started the ride that ended in ambush and violence. Elias worked efficiently at the fireplace, heating food in a cast-iron skillet. Clara watched him move around the small cabin, noting how comfortable he seemed in this simple space. This was a man who'd chosen solitude, she realized, chosen to live apart from towns and people and all the complications they brought. Yet here he was, taking in a wounded stranger and promising to help her fight a battle that wasn't his. Why? She asked suddenly. Why are you really doing this? You could have just taken me to town, left me with a doctor, and walked away. Why get involved? Elias was quiet for a moment, stirring the beans in the skillet. When he finally spoke, he didn't turn around. Because somebody should have, he said simply. Because I've seen too many good people get trampled by bad ones, and I'm tired of it. Because you remind me of... He stopped abruptly, then started again. You remind me that there are still things worth fighting for in this world. He brought her a plate of food, simple fare, but hot and surprisingly good. Clara ate slowly, mindful of her split lip and the way her jaw ached when she chewed. Elias sat across from her, nursing his own meal, and for a while they ate in companionable silence. Tell me about your father, Elias said eventually. What kind of man was he? Clara smiled despite the pain it caused her face. He was a dreamer, always chasing the next big thing, the next opportunity. My mother died when I was young, and after that it was just the two of us. He tried to give me a stable life in Boston, worked as a clerk in a shipping company, but I could see it was killing him slowly, all those rules and schedules and proper society. So he came west, Elias said. 5 years ago, I was 20 years old, working as a seamstress to support myself. He wrote me letters about Montana, about the freedom here, the wide open spaces, about finding gold. Clara's voice softened with memory. He was so excited in those letters, like a boy again instead of a middle-aged man who'd spent his life behind a desk. And he found it. The gold, I mean. Not a fortune, but enough. He wrote that he'd finally done it, finally made something of himself that was his, not dependent on anyone else. He asked me to come out, said we could build a life here together. Clara's throat tightened. I was saving money for the train fare when I got the letter saying he'd died. Heart attack, sudden and quick. The lawyer said he probably didn't suffer. I'm sorry, Elias said quietly. Clara shook her head. I barely had time to grieve before the bills started coming. Turned out my father had debts I didn't know about. Medical expenses from when he was sick the year before, money he'd borrowed to improve the mine. The only asset he had was the claim itself. So I had to come here, had to try to claim it so I could sell it and pay off his debts. I never expected... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. You never expected men would try to kill you for it, Elias finished. No, I thought this was a civilized territory. I thought the law would protect me. Clara laughed bitterly. I was naive. You were trusting, Elias corrected. There's a difference. What happened to you wasn't your fault, Miss Whitmore. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. They finished their meal, and Elias cleared the plates away. Clara felt exhaustion pulling at her again, despite having slept through the night. Healing, she knew, took energy that her battered body desperately needed to conserve. You should rest more, Elias said, noticing her drooping eyelids. Sleep is the best medicine right now. I feel like all I've done is sleep, Clara protested weakly. And you'll do more of it. Your body's been through hell, and it needs time to recover. He helped her lie back down, adjusting the pillow behind her head and pulling the blanket up to her chin. I'll be here if you need anything. Just call out. Clara wanted to protest that she wasn't a child who needed looking after, but the truth was she did need help. Her body wasn't capable of much beyond breathing and hurting right now, so she closed her eyes and let herself drift, listening to the comforting sounds of Elias moving around the cabin, the scrape of a chair, the splash of water being poured, the soft crackle of the fire. She dreamed fitfully, fragments of memory mixing with imagination. Her father's face smiling as he showed her a nugget of gold in his last letter. The three men looming over her, fists and boots falling. And then Elias, emerging from the darkness like some avenging angel, his voice cutting through her terror with steady certainty. When she woke again, the light had shifted. Afternoon, she judged, noting the angle of the sun through the window. She felt marginally better, still in pain, but more alert, more present. She could hear Elias outside, the rhythmic sound of wood being chopped. Clara carefully sat up, taking inventory of her injuries. Her ribs still ached fiercely with every breath, and her face felt like a bruised peach, but she thought she might be able to stand if she was careful. Using the wall for support, Clara managed to get to her feet. The room spun for a moment, and she had to close her eyes and breathe deeply until it steadied. When she opened them again, she noticed for the first time how sparse the cabin really was. Besides the bed, table, and 2 chairs, there was almost nothing. A shelf held a few tin plates and cups, some basic food supplies. A hook by the door supported a heavy coat and a gun belt. A small trunk in the corner probably held Elias's clothes. That was it. No photographs, no personal items, no sign that anyone really lived here in any permanent sense. It was the home of a man who was ready to leave at any moment, Clara realized. A man who kept no ties, no attachments to places or things. The door opened and Elias came in, his arms full of split wood. He stopped short when he saw Clara standing. You shouldn't be up, he said, though his tone was more concerned than chiding. I needed to move, Clara said. I can't just lie in bed forever. Elias set the wood down by the fireplace and came over to her, studying her face critically. How do you feel? Dizzy? Nauseous? A little dizzy at first, but it passed. I'm all right. Come sit at the table then. Standing's probably not the best idea yet. He helped her over to one of the chairs, supporting her weight as she lowered herself carefully into it. There. That's better. Clara looked around the cabin from this new vantage point. You live here alone? Have for about 3 years now. Bought the place from a trapper who was heading farther north. It's not much, but it suits my needs. It's isolated, Clara observed. That's the point. Elias busied himself making more coffee. After I left the Marshalls, I wanted somewhere quiet. Somewhere I wouldn't have to deal with people and their problems every day. Found this place and decided it was perfect. And yet here you are, dealing with my problems, Clara said softly. Elias glanced at her, something complicated crossing his face. Some things are worth making exceptions for. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table, settling into the chair across from her. For a while they just sat there, drinking coffee and watching the afternoon light paint shadows across the rough timber walls. It was peaceful, Clara thought. Surprisingly so, given everything she'd been through. Can I ask you something? She said eventually. You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. When you found me last night, how did you know where to look? These woods are huge, and it was dark. Elias cradled his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. I was about 5 miles south of here, checking some snares I'd set. Heard horses moving fast, voices. Didn't sound right, too aggressive, too purposeful, so I followed the sound, kept my distance. By the time I got close enough to see, they were already riding away, and I found the signs of a struggle. Blood on the ground, torn fabric caught on branches. I knew someone had been hurt, and hurt bad. And you tracked me from there, Clara said. Wasn't hard. You'd left a trail, broken branches, disturbed leaves, more blood. I just followed it until I found you. His jaw tightened. When I saw you trying to drag yourself through those woods, saw what they'd done to you. I haven't felt that kind of anger in a long time, Miss Whitmore. Clara studied him across the table. You said you quit being a marshal because the law couldn't reach the guilty. But you still care about justice, don't you? That's why you helped me. Justice is a complicated word, Elias said slowly. I've seen too many bad men escape it on technicalities, seen too many good people suffer because the law moved too slow or not at all. So yes, I care about justice. But my version of it doesn't always look like what a judge would approve. Good, Clara said firmly, because I don't want legal justice for what those men did to me. I want real justice, the kind that makes sure they never hurt anyone else the way they hurt me. Elias met her eyes, and Clara saw understanding there and approval. That kind of justice usually comes with a price, Miss Whitmore. You sure you're willing to pay it? Clara thought about her father, about the dreams he'd had for that mine, about the life they could have built together if he'd lived. She thought about the moment when Doyle's fist had connected with her face, about the cold certainty that she was going to die alone in those woods. And she thought about the 3 men who'd done this to her, who probably weren't losing any sleep over leaving her for dead. Yes, she said, I'm sure. Elias nodded slowly. All right then. We'll start planning tomorrow. For today, you need to rest more. Let your body heal. But tomorrow, we start building our case. They spent the rest of the afternoon in comfortable conversation. Elias told her about life in Montana, about the harsh winters and the brief, glorious summers, about the way the territory was changing, becoming more civilized, for better or worse. Clara told him about Boston, about the society life she'd never quite fit into, about her work as a seamstress and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with her own hands. As evening fell, Elias made a simple dinner, more beans and salt pork, along with some wild onions he'd foraged. Clara ate more easily now, the swelling in her face having gone down slightly. Her body still hurt, but it was a duller pain, more manageable. After dinner, Elias spread a bedroll on the floor near the fireplace while Clara settled back into the bed. She felt guilty about taking his sleeping space, but he'd been adamant, and she was too tired to argue effectively. Mr. Boone? She called softly as he banked the fire for the night. Yes, ma'am? Thank you for everything, for saving my life, for believing me, for being willing to help me. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Elias turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. You don't owe me anything, Miss Whitmore. Sometimes people just need help, and if you can provide it, you do. That's all. It's not all, Clara insisted. Not everyone would do what you're doing. Maybe not, but I'm not everyone. He settled into his bedroll, wrapping himself in a heavy blanket. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow, we have work to do. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the fire crackle and pop. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines, a sound both lonely and comforting. She thought about the days ahead, about the dangerous game they were about to play. Part of her was terrified. These were men who'd already tried to kill her once. They wouldn't hesitate to finish the job if they knew she'd survived. But another part of her, a part she hadn't known existed until today, was eager for the fight. Those men had tried to break her, tried to erase her from existence as casually as you'd brush away a fly. They'd failed. And now, with Elias Boone at her side, she was going to make sure they regretted that failure for whatever time they had left. In the darkness of the cabin, Clara Whitmore smiled despite her bruised and battered face. Doyle, Phelps, and Riker thought they'd buried their problem in those dark woods. Instead, they'd created something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, backed by a man who knew exactly how to make bad men pay. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, she would rest and heal and gather her strength, because when she faced those men again, and she would face them, she would be ready. They'd tried to write her ending in blood and cold. Now she was going to write theirs in justice, whatever form that justice might take. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. Claire's body healed slowly but steadily. The swelling in her face went down, the cuts began to scab over, and breathing became slightly less painful with each passing morning. But it was the evenings that changed everything, when she and Elias sat at that rough wooden table and planned their revenge with the careful precision of generals mapping a campaign. On the third night after her rescue, Elias spread a hand-drawn map across the table between them. The lamplight flickered over crude lines representing the hills and valleys around Helena, with an X marking where Clara's father's mine was located. "This is where we start," Elias said, tapping the X with his finger. "Your father's claim. We need to know exactly what's there, what condition it's in, and what Doyle and his men have been doing with it since your father died." Clara leaned forward, studying the map despite the lingering ache in her ribs. "How do we find that out without them knowing I'm alive?" "I go," Elias said simply. "Tomorrow morning. I'll ride up there, pretend to be a prospector looking for work. Men like Doyle always need extra hands, especially if they're trying to work a claim that's bigger than 3 men can handle alone. I'll get close, see what I can learn." "That's dangerous," Clara objected. "What if they recognize you? What if they saw you that night?" Elias shook his head. "They didn't. I made sure to stay well back, and it was dark besides. As far as they know, I'm just another drifter looking for wages. I've played this part before, Miss Whitmore. I know how to be invisible when I need to be." Clara wanted to argue further, but she could see the logic in his plan. She was the one who couldn't show her face, literally, but Elias could move freely, could gather information, could be their eyes and ears while she stayed hidden and healed. "All right," she said reluctantly, "but you have to promise me you'll be careful. I won't have your blood on my conscience along with everything else." Something flickered in Elias's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. "I promise. I'll go in, look around, ask some questions, and get out. Nothing dramatic. Just reconnaissance." "And while you're gone?" Clara asked. "You stay here. Keep the door barred. There's a rifle above the door and a revolver in the table drawer, both loaded. If anyone comes calling who isn't me, you use them. Understand?" Clara nodded, though the thought of being alone here made her nervous. In the days since the attack, she'd grown used to Elias's solid presence, the way he moved through the cabin with quiet confidence. The idea of being without that presence, even for a day, unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. "I'll be back before dark," Elias assured her, as if reading her thoughts. "And if something goes wrong, if I'm not back by full dark, you take my horse and ride south. There's a settlement about 15 miles that direction. You'll be safe there." "I'm not leaving you," Clara said firmly. "Miss Whitmore." "Clara," she interrupted, "we've been living in the same room for 3 days now, and you've seen me at my absolute worst. I think you can call me Clara." Elias smiled slightly, the expression softening his weathered features. All right then. Clara. And you should call me Elias. Mr. Boone makes me feel like I should be sitting in church, not planning how to take down 3 murderous claim jumpers. Despite everything, Clara found herself smiling back. There was something about Elias that made her feel safe, even when they were discussing dangerous plans. Maybe it was the calm way he approached everything, or the competence that radiated from him like heat from a fire. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was just that he'd proven himself willing to fight for her when no one else would. Elias, then, she said. But my point stands. If something happens to you, I want to know. I won't just run away and leave you to face whatever trouble alone. Stubborn, Elias observed, but there was approval in his voice. Your father must have had his hands full raising you. He always said I got my stubbornness from my mother, Clara replied. She was Boston Irish, came over during the famine. My father used to joke that she could out-argue a Philadelphia lawyer and out-stubborn a Missouri mule. Sounds like a formidable woman. She was. I wish I remembered her better. Clara traced one of the lines on the map absently. I was only 7 when she died. Cholera outbreak. My father never really recovered from losing her. I think that's part of why he came west. Too many memories back in Boston. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Elias folded up the map and stood. You should get some rest. I'll be leaving before dawn and I want to make sure you're comfortable before I go. Over the past few days, they'd fallen into an evening routine. Elias would help Clara walk around the cabin, short trips at first, just to the door and back, but getting longer each day as her strength returned. The movement was painful but necessary, he'd explained. Staying in bed too long would make her weak, and they needed her strong for what was coming. Tonight's walk took them to the cabin door and back 3 times. By the 3rd circuit, Claire was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool evening air, but she felt a sense of accomplishment. A week ago, she'd been crawling through the woods, certain she was dying. Now she could walk, albeit slowly and painfully. It was progress. That's good, Elias said as he helped her back to bed. You're healing faster than I expected. Another week and you'll be ready to travel. A week feels like forever, Clara said, settling back against the pillows with a wince. Patience is part of this, Clara. We can't rush it. If we move too fast, make mistakes. Those men will know you're alive. And if they know that, they'll come for you again. This time they won't leave you breathing. Clara knew he was right, but that didn't make waiting any easier. She wanted to act, wanted to confront Doyle and his cohorts, wanted to see justice done. But justice, real justice, required patience and planning. Tell me something, she said as Elias moved to bank the fire for the night. When you were a marshal, did it ever get easier? Waiting for the right moment to act? Elias paused, poker in hand, staring into the flames. No, he said finally. It never got easier. But I learned that patience usually meant the difference between catching your man and getting yourself killed. The ones who rushed in, who let anger or vengeance drive them instead of strategy, they were the ones who ended up in pine boxes. Is that what happened to you? Is that why you quit? He was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he set the poker down and came to sit on the edge of the bed, his expression distant. I told you about Caldwell, the rancher who was terrorizing homesteaders. What I didn't tell you was that before I handled that situation, I tried doing it the right way. I spent 6 months gathering evidence, tracking witnesses, building an airtight case. I was patient. I followed every rule, dotted every I, and crossed every T. And you know what happened? Clara shook her head. Judge threw it all out on a technicality. Something about how I'd obtained one of the witness statements. It was bullshit. The judge was corrupt. Everyone knew it. But it was legal bullshit. And Caldwell walked free. Elias's hands clenched into fists on his knees. 2 weeks later, that family burned. I heard the screams in my nightmares for months afterward. Still do sometimes. So you made sure he couldn't hurt anyone else, Clara said softly. I made sure. But by then I'd learned that all my patience, all my careful work following the rules, had gotten innocent people killed. So I quit. Because what was the point of wearing a badge if it couldn't protect people from men like Caldwell? Clara reached out and placed her hand over his clenched fist. You protected them in the end. That's what matters. Elias looked down at her hand on his, then met her eyes. In the firelight, his face was all hard angles and shadows, but his eyes were soft with something that might have been gratitude or might have been pain. Maybe, he said, but it cost me everything I thought I was, everything I thought I believed in. And what do you believe in now? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. I believe in keeping my promises. I believe in protecting people who can't protect themselves. And I believe that sometimes the only way to stop bad men from doing bad things is to be willing to do worse things to them. It should have frightened her, that casual admission of violence, but Clara found herself squeezing his hand instead, acknowledging the dark truth in his words, because she understood now, in a way she never had before, that the world wasn't divided neatly into good and evil. There were good people who did bad things for the right reasons, and there were bad people who hid behind the law's protection. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice required getting your hands dirty. Thank you, she said, for telling me, for trusting me with that. Elias nodded and stood, gently extricating his hand from hers. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, and I need you rested. Clara lay back and closed her eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. She listened to Elias settle into his bedroll by the fire, heard his breathing gradually slow and deepen, and she thought about the man who'd saved her life, about the darkness he carried inside him, and the way he'd chosen to use it to protect rather than destroy. She must have eventually dozed off, because the next thing she knew, gray dawn light was filtering through the window, and Elias was moving quietly around the cabin, gathering supplies. Clara kept her eyes mostly closed, watching him through her lashes as he checked his weapons, filled his canteen, packed some food in his saddlebag. He moved with the economy of motion that came from years of practice. No wasted movements, everything efficient and purposeful. Just before he left, he came to stand by her bed. Clara opened her eyes fully and found him looking down at her, his expression serious. Remember what I said. Door barred, weapons ready. Anyone comes who isn't me, you shoot first and ask questions later. I remember, Clara said. Be careful up there. Always am. He hesitated, then added, There's fresh water in the bucket, food in the pantry, and more wood by the fireplace. You should have everything you need. I'll be fine. It's you I'm worried about. Elias smiled slightly. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, Clara. I'll be back before you know it. And then he was gone, slipping out the door into the pre-dawn darkness. Clara heard his horse's hooves on the hard ground, the sound gradually fading as he rode away. Then there was only silence and the faint whistle of wind through the pines. Clara forced herself to get up, to move around despite the lingering pain in her body. She couldn't just lie in bed all day worrying. Instead, she busied herself with small tasks, tidying the already neat cabin, mending a tear in her dress with needle and thread she found in Elias's trunk, preparing food for when he returned. The mundane activities helped keep her mind occupied, kept her from imagining all the things that could go wrong. But as the day wore on and the sun climbed higher in the sky, Clara found it harder and harder to keep her anxiety at bay. What if Doyle recognized Elias from somewhere? What if they'd somehow learned he'd helped her? What if there was trouble and he couldn't get away? She tried to tell herself she was being foolish. Elias was competent, experienced, careful. He'd been a marshal for 8 years and had clearly survived plenty of dangerous situations since then. He knew what he was doing, but knowing that intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things, Clara had lost her mother to disease, her father to a failing heart, and had nearly lost her own life to violence. The thought of losing Elias, too, of being alone again in this harsh territory, terrified her in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. By late afternoon, she was pacing the cabin despite the pain it caused, going to the window every few minutes to scan the tree line for signs of movement. The rifle Elias had mentioned was indeed above the door, and Clara took it down, checking to make sure it was loaded as he'd said. The weight of it in her hands was both foreign and strangely comforting. She'd never fired a gun in her life, but she'd watched her father clean his hunting rifle enough times to understand the basics. The sun was just beginning to touch the western horizon when she finally heard it, the sound of hooves approaching. Clara's heart leaped into her throat, and she grabbed the rifle, positioning herself beside the window where she could see out but wouldn't be immediately visible to anyone approaching. The rider came into view through the trees, and Clara felt relief flood through her so intensely she had to lean against the wall for support. Elias. It was Elias, alone and apparently unharmed, riding his bay gelding at an easy pace. She set the rifle aside and unbarred the door, pulling it open just as Elias dismounted. He looked tired, she thought, lines of tension around his eyes and mouth, but he was intact. "Well?" Clara asked as he led his horse to the small lean-to that served as a stable. "What did you learn?" "Let me tend to the horse first," Elias said. "Then we'll talk." Clara wanted to demand answers immediately, but she recognized the wisdom in his words. A horse that wasn't properly cared for was a liability, especially out here where your life might depend on how fast and far your mount could carry you. So she waited, forcing herself to be patient while Elias unsaddled the gelding, brushed him down, and made sure he had food and water. Finally, Elias came into the cabin, shrugging out of his coat and hanging it by the door. Clara had coffee waiting and a plate of the salt pork and beans she'd warmed up. He nodded his thanks and sat down at the table, taking a long drink of the hot coffee before he spoke. "Your father's mine is bigger than I expected," he said without preamble. "A real operation, not just some small-time prospector's claim. Doyle, Phelps, and Riker have been working it hard since your father died, and they're pulling decent gold out of it. Not a fortune, but enough to make them very motivated to keep it." "Did you talk to them?" Clara asked, sitting across from him. "I did. Wrote up about mid-morning, said I was looking for work. Doyle did most of the talking. He's clearly the leader of the three. Hard man, suspicious, but greedy enough that the idea of extra labor for cheap wages appealed to him." Elias paused, his jaw tightening. "He made some comments about your father. Nothing good. Said Thomas Whitmore had been a soft Easterner who didn't know the first thing about real mining, that they'd been doing all the work while he took the profits." Clara felt anger flare hot in her chest. "That's a lie. My father worked that claim himself. His letters were full of details about the mining, about how hard but satisfying the work was." "I know it's a lie," Elias said calmly, "but it's the lie they're telling anyone who'll listen. Building their case for why they deserve the claim more than you do. They're being smart about it, Clara, spreading stories, making themselves look like the victims of some Eastern girl who wants to steal their rightful property. But I have documentation, legal proof, which they stole from you and probably burned. And without you alive to testify, without those original documents, their word against the word of a dead man's distant daughter who never even came west while he was alive, well, a judge might just side with the men who've been working the claim and pulling gold out of it." Clara pressed her hands flat against the table, trying to control her temper. "So what do we do?" "We prove they're liars. We get new documentation from Boston, that lawyer you mentioned, Harrison. We gather witnesses who knew your father who can testify about his relationship with these men, and we catch them in the act of filing a false claim." Elias leaned forward, his expression intense. "But most importantly, we need to prove they tried to kill you. That changes everything from a civil claim dispute to attempted murder. And murder, Clara, that's something even a corrupt judge has a hard time overlooking." "How do we prove it?" "There were no witnesses." "We make them confess," Elias said simply. Clara stared at him. "Make them confess? How?" "I don't know yet. I'm still working on that part, but men like Doyle, they're arrogant. They think they got away with it. And arrogant men make mistakes." He took another drink of his coffee, considering. "I told Doyle I'd come back in a few days with an answer about the work. Said I needed to finish up a job I was on first. That gives us time to plan our next move." "Which is?" "First, we get you strong enough to ride. You're healing well, but you're not ready for a hard journey yet. Second, we send a telegram to Boston, get that lawyer working on replacement documentation. Third, we figure out exactly how we're going to play this when we go to Helena." Clara absorbed all of this, her mind racing. "When we go to Helena, they'll see me. They'll know I survived." "That's the point," Elias said with a grim smile. "Imagine you're Doyle. You beat a woman nearly to death and left her in the woods to freeze. You've spent weeks believing she's dead, that you got away with murder. And then one day she walks into the land office in Helena, alive and ready to file her claim. with a witness, with documentation, with a story about how you tried to kill her. He'll panic, Clara said slowly, understanding dawning. He'll more than panic. He'll make mistakes, and when he makes mistakes, we'll be there to catch him in them. Elias stood and moved to the fireplace, adding more wood to the flames. But it's going to be dangerous, Clara. I won't lie to you about that. When Doyle realizes you're alive, his first instinct will be to finish the job. We'll need to be ready for that. I'll be ready, Clara said firmly. I'm not the same woman who got ambushed on that trail. Not anymore. Elias turned to look at her, studying her face in the firelight. No, he said after a moment. I don't suppose you are. They spent the rest of the evening refining their plan. Elias would ride to the nearest town with telegraph service, a place called Timber Creek, about 20 miles south, and send a wire to Clara's lawyer in Boston. They needed copies of her father's will, the deed to the mine, any correspondence between her father and the lawyer that established Clara's identity and her right to inherit. It would take time for those documents to arrive, maybe 2 weeks or more, but they'd be legal proof that couldn't be disputed. In the meantime, Clara would continue to heal and regain her strength. Elias would make periodic visits to the mine, establishing himself as someone Doyle trusted, gathering more information about their operation and their plans. And when everything was in place, when Clara was strong and they had their evidence assembled, they'd make their move. There's something else, Elias said as the night grew late and the fire burned low. Something I noticed today that concerns me. What? Doyle's not just working your father's claim, he's expanding it. I saw survey stakes going up in territory that's clearly outside the original boundaries. He's planning to claim a whole lot more land than what your father owned. Clara felt fresh anger rise. He can't do that. He can if no one challenges him. And who's going to challenge him? As far as everyone knows, Thomas Whitmore is dead and his sole heir is also dead. There's no one left to contest the claim. Elias met her eyes across the table. That's why this matters, Clara. It's not just about your father's mine anymore. It's about stopping Doyle from stealing even more land, from setting himself up as some kind of mining baron built on theft and murder. Then we stop him, Clara said. Whatever it takes. Elias nodded slowly. Whatever it takes. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Clara knew what they were really talking about. If legal means failed, if the system proved as corrupt as Elias feared, they were prepared to seek justice outside the law. It was a line she'd never imagined crossing, not back in her old life in Boston, where the world was orderly and civilized and people trusted in institutions to protect them. But that world seemed very far away now. This was Montana territory, where justice was often decided by the fastest gun or the strongest will, where good men had to be willing to do hard things to protect the innocent, where sometimes the only way to stop a bad man was to be worse. Clara stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark forest beyond. Somewhere out there, Doyle, Phelps, and Riker were sleeping soundly, confident in their victory, certain they'd gotten away with theft and attempted murder. They had no idea that their victim had survived, that she was healing and planning and preparing to bring their world crashing down around them. What are you thinking? Elias asked from behind her. Clara turned to face him. I'm thinking about what you said before, about how you believe in keeping promises. Well, I'm making a promise now. To my father, to myself, to every person those men have ever hurt or will hurt in the future. I promise I'm going to see them pay for what they've done. In court if possible, but if not in court, then somewhere else. Some way. They're going to pay. Elias came to stand beside her at the window. That's a dangerous promise, Clara. Revenge has a way of consuming people, of turning them into something they don't want to be. This isn't revenge, Clara said. This is justice. There's a difference. Is there? Elias asked quietly. I've spent a lot of years trying to figure that out, and I'm still not sure I know the answer. Clara looked up at him, at this hard man with the gentle hands and the haunted eyes. You saved my life when you had no reason to. You've taken me in, protected me, helped me plan to reclaim what's mine. If that's not justice, I don't know what is. Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he placed his hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity and support. Then we'll see this through together. All the way to the end, whatever that end looks like. Clara covered his hand with hers, acknowledging the bond that had formed between them over these past few days. It was more than just helper and helped, more than just two people thrown together by circumstance. It was a partnership forged in darkness and violence, and the shared understanding that sometimes good people had to be willing to fight back against the cruelty of the world. Together, she agreed, all the way to the end. 2 weeks passed like water through a sieve, too slow when Clara lay awake at night, impatient for action, and too fast when she considered how much still needed to be done. But they were productive weeks. Elias made the ride to Timber Creek and sent the telegram to Boston. He returned with news that Mr. Harrison had received the message and was already preparing the necessary documents. They would arrive by courier within 10 days, maybe less if the weather held. In the meantime, Clara healed. The bruises faded from purple to yellow-green and finally to nothing. The cuts became scars. Thin white lines that would always remind her of that night in the woods, but no longer hurt to touch. Her ribs mended enough that she could breathe deeply without wincing, could move without feeling like knives were being driven into her sides. And most importantly, she could ride. Elias had insisted on testing that particular skill before they made any concrete plans. On a crisp morning when frost still clung to the pine needles and their breath formed clouds in the cold air, he'd saddled his horse and helped Clara mount. She'd been nervous, afraid her body would betray her, afraid the pain would be too much. But once she was in the saddle, once she felt the familiar rhythm of the horse beneath her, something clicked into place. She was still sore, still weaker than she'd been before the attack, but she could ride. And that meant she could fight. "Good," Elias had said, watching her circle the clearing with growing confidence. "You're ready." Now, on a gray afternoon 3 days before they planned to ride to Helena, Elias made another trip to the mine. This time he took work with Doyle, spending a full day hauling ore and working the sluice boxes, getting close to the operation and the men running it. When he returned that evening, his clothes were covered in mud and his hands bore fresh blisters, but his eyes were sharp with new information. "They're planning to file their claim next week," he said without preamble, accepting the coffee Clara handed him. "Heard Doyle talking to Phelps about it. They've got the paperwork ready, forged documents claiming they've been working that land for 3 years with your father as a silent partner who died owing them money. It's all lies, but it's convincing lies. Professional. They've clearly done this before." Clara felt her stomach clench with anger. "We need those documents from Boston, soon." "They'll be here in time," Elias assured her. "Harrison's courier is supposed to arrive in Timber Creek by Saturday. I'll ride down and meet him, then we'll go straight to Helena on Sunday. We'll file your claim Monday morning before Doyle even knows we're there." "And when he finds out?" Elias's expression turned grim. "Then things get interesting. That's why I need you to understand something, Clara. When we ride into Helena, when we make our move, there's no going back. Doyle will know you're alive, he'll know you're a threat, and he will try to eliminate that threat permanently." "I know," Clara said steadily. "I've been thinking about nothing else for 2 weeks. Thinking about it and living it are different things. When a man points a gun at you, when you can see in his eyes that he fully intends to kill you, it changes you. I need to know you're ready for that. Really ready, not just intellectually ready." Clara set down her own coffee and met his eyes directly. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night? You said I wasn't dying alone. Well, I'm not dying at all. Not for Doyle, not for anyone. Whatever comes, whatever I have to do to survive it, I'm ready." Elias studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you. But believing it and making sure you have the tools to survive are two different things, which is why we're going to spend the next few days making sure you can actually defend yourself." He stood and moved to the trunk in the corner, pulling out the revolver Clara had seen him wearing that first night. It was a Colt Peacemaker, well-maintained and clearly well-used. He checked the cylinder, then removed the bullets and handed the empty weapon to Clara. "First lesson," he said. "Get comfortable with the weight of it, how it feels in your hand, how it balances. Don't try to aim or shoot yet, just hold it." Clara wrapped her fingers around the grip, feeling the cool metal and smooth wood against her palm. The gun was heavier than she'd expected, solid and somehow more real than anything else in the cabin. This was a tool designed for one purpose: to kill. The thought should have frightened her, but instead she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her shoulders. Good, Elias said, watching her. Now, I'm going to teach you the basics: how to load it, how to aim it, how to fire it without killing yourself or anyone you don't intend to kill. But more than that, I'm going to teach you when to use it and when not to. Because a gun is only useful if you're willing to pull the trigger when it matters, and only if you have the judgment to know when that is. They spent the rest of the afternoon in what Elias called dry practice. Clara learned how to load and unload the cylinder, how to check if the weapon was ready to fire, how to cock the hammer. She learned the proper stance: feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, both hands on the grip for stability. She learned to sight down the barrel, to squeeze the trigger gently rather than jerking it. All of this with an empty gun, going through the motions again and again until they became almost natural. Tomorrow we'll do live fire practice, Elias said as evening fell and they moved back inside. There's a hollow about a mile from here where the sound won't carry too far. We'll spend the morning there, let you get used to the recoil and the noise. By the time we ride to Helena, I want you comfortable enough with that gun that you don't have to think about using it. Will that be enough? Clara asked. A few days of practice against men who've probably been shooting their whole lives? You're not trying to outdraw them in some dime novel gunfight, Elias said. You're trying to survive long enough for help to arrive or for them to make a mistake. Big difference. And besides, you'll have me watching your back. There was something in the way he said it, a quiet certainty that made Clara feel safer than she had any right to feel given what they were about to attempt. Elias Boone was a dangerous man. She'd come to understand that clearly over the past weeks. But his danger was directed outward, at threats and enemies, never at her, never at the innocent. That night, Clara lay in bed listening to Elias's steady breathing from his bedroll by the fire, and she thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time. A month ago, she'd been a seamstress in Boston, worried about paying rent and wondering if she'd ever have the courage to claim her father's mine. Now she was planning an assault, there was no other word for it, on 3 men who'd tried to murder her, learning to shoot a gun, preparing to ride into danger with a former lawman who'd promised to see her through to the other side. She should have been terrified. Part of her was. But another part, a part she was only beginning to discover, felt alive in a way she never had before. As if everything that had come before had been preparation for this moment, for this fight. Her father used to say that some people were born to safe, quiet lives, while others were forged in fire. Clara had always assumed she was the former. Now she was learning she might be the latter. The next morning dawned cold and clear, perfect weather for target practice. After a quick breakfast, Elias led Clara to the hollow he'd mentioned, a small depression in the hills surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would contain the sound of gunfire. He'd brought several tin cans and a plank of wood, which he set up at various distances from where they'd be standing. Start with the closest target, he instructed, handing her the loaded revolver. Remember everything we practiced yesterday. Stance, grip, sight, squeeze. And Clara, it's going to be loud, and the recoil is going to kick harder than you expect. Don't let it surprise you. Clara nodded, settling into the stance he'd taught her. She raised the gun, sighted down the barrel at the closest tin can about 15 feet away, and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared and bucked in her hands, the sound impossibly loud even though Elias had warned her. The bullet went wide, kicking up dirt 3 feet to the left of the target. Clara's hands were shaking from the recoil and the sheer visceral shock of actually firing a weapon. Good first try, Elias said calmly. You kept your eyes open and you didn't drop the gun. That's better than a lot of people's first shot. Now try again, and this time anticipate the kick. Let your arms absorb it. Clara took a deep breath and fired again. This time the bullet came closer, maybe a foot to the right of the can. The third shot hit the plank behind the target. The fourth shot grazed the can, sending it spinning. There you go, Elias said with approval. You're getting the feel for it. Keep practicing. They spent the entire morning in that hollow, Clara firing round after round until her arms ached and her ears rang despite the cloth Elias had her stuff in them to muffle the sound. But slowly, gradually, she improved. By noon, she could hit the close targets more often than she missed them. The farther ones were still beyond her skill, but as Elias pointed out, she wouldn't be shooting at distant targets. If things went badly in Helena, Her enemies would be close. One more thing, Elias said as they prepared to head back to the cabin. He drew his own gun in a smooth, practiced motion and fired 3 times in rapid succession. 3 distant cans flew off their perches. If shooting starts, don't try to be a hero. Get to cover, stay low, and only shoot if you have a clear target. I'll handle the rest. You're very good at that, Clara observed, impressed despite herself by the casual display of skill. I've had a lot of practice, Elias said grimly, more than I ever wanted. Come on, let's get back. We've got planning to do. Back at the cabin, they spread the map on the table once again. Elias had sketched in more details from his visits to the mine and his trips to Timber Creek, the layout of Helena's streets, the location of the land office, the sheriff's station, places where they might find allies or trouble. The key is timing, Elias said, tracing a route with his finger. We ride in Sunday night, stay at the hotel. Monday morning, first thing, we go to the land office. You file your claim before anyone knows you're in town. That gives us the legal high ground. But Doyle will find out eventually, Clara said. Oh, he'll find out within hours. Helena's not that big, and news travels fast. The minute you walk into that land office, someone will recognize you, or recognize the claim name, and word will spread. Doyle might even be in town that day. It's a popular day for filing claims. The question is, what does he do when he finds out? Clara thought about it, trying to put herself in Doyle's mind. He can't kill me in broad daylight, in the middle of town. Too many witnesses. Right, so he'll wait. He'll watch. He'll try to catch you alone or catch us both somewhere he can claim self-defense or make it look like an accident. Elias leaned back in his chair, which is why we're not going to give him that chance. After we file the claim, we go straight to the sheriff. You think the sheriff will help us? Clara asked skeptically. You said yourself that law in Montana can be corrupt. The sheriff in Helena is a man named McCall. I knew him years ago when I was marshalling. He's honest, or was last time I saw him. If we can get to him before Doyle does, tell him about the attack, show him your injuries and your documentation, he might be willing to provide protection. At minimum, he'll be watching Doyle, which makes it harder for Doyle to make a move. And if McCall isn't honest anymore? If Doyle's already gotten to him? Elias's expression turned hard. Then we rely on ourselves. But we won't know until we try. The important thing is, we go in with a plan, with our eyes open, and we don't take unnecessary risks. Our goal is to reclaim your mine and see those men face justice. Getting killed trying to do it defeats the purpose. They spent the rest of that day and the next going over every detail, planning for every contingency they could think of. What if Doyle was already at the land office when they arrived? What if the sheriff refused to help? What if violence broke out despite their precautions? For each scenario, they developed a response, a backup plan, an escape route. On Saturday morning, Elias rode to Timber Creek to meet Harrison's courier. He returned that evening with a leather satchel containing everything they needed: copies of Thomas Whitmore's will, the original deed to the mine, letters of correspondence establishing Clara's identity, and even a notarized statement from Harrison himself attesting to the legitimacy of all the documents. It was exactly what they needed to prove Clara's legal claim beyond any shadow of doubt. This is good, Elias said, reviewing the documents by lamplight. Very thorough. Your father's lawyer knew what he was doing. He was my father's friend for 20 years, Clara said. When I wrote to him about coming west, he warned me it might be dangerous. I thought he was just being overprotective. I should have listened. You couldn't have known what would happen, Elias said. And even if you had, would it have changed anything? Would you have given up your legal claim to avoid the risk? Clara thought about it honestly. No, she admitted. I needed that mine. The money from selling it was the only way to pay off my father's debts and have anything left to start a new life. I would have come regardless. Then there's no point in second-guessing yourself. We deal with the situation as it is, not as we wish it had been. He carefully returned the documents to the satchel and set it aside. We leave at first light tomorrow. It's about a 4-hour ride to Helena if we push it. We'll arrive by late afternoon, get rooms at the hotel, and be ready for Monday morning. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow, everything changes. But Clara found sleep elusive that night. She lay in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the cabin, the pop and crackle of the fire, Elias's breathing, the wind in the pines outside. Tomorrow they would ride to Helena. Tomorrow she would face the men who'd tried to kill her. Tomorrow, one way or another, her fate would be decided. She must have eventually dozed because the next thing she knew, Elias was gently shaking her shoulder. "Time to go," he said quietly. "Sun's almost up." They prepared in silence, eating a quick breakfast of coffee and hardtack, gathering their supplies. Clara wore the best dress she had, the one she'd been wearing the night of the attack, now cleaned and mended as best she could manage. It wasn't much, but it was respectable enough for appearing at the land office. Elias had insisted she dress like the proper Eastern lady she was, not like someone who'd been living rough in a cabin for 3 weeks. "Appearances matter," he'd explained. "You need to look like Thomas Whitmore's refined daughter, not like some desperate woman making wild claims. The more respectable you appear, the harder it is for Doyle to paint you as the villain in this story." Clara also wore the gun. Elias had found a way to rig a holster that hung concealed beneath her skirts, accessible through a slit in the fabric. It felt strange having that weight against her leg, but also oddly reassuring. She was armed. She was prepared. She was not the helpless victim Doyle had left in the woods. The ride to Helena was tense. They kept to back trails when possible, avoiding the main road where they might be seen by anyone who knew Doyle. Elias rode with his hand never far from his gun, his eyes constantly scanning the forest around them, but they encountered no one, and by late afternoon they crested a hill and saw Helena spread out below them. It was bigger than Clara had expected, a proper town with wooden buildings lining muddy streets, a church steeple rising above the rest, smoke from dozens of chimneys dirtying the autumn sky. She could hear the sounds of industry even from this distance, hammers on anvils, the rumble of wagons, the shouts of men loading timber. This was Montana's capital, a place of commerce and law and civilization carved out of the wilderness. "Remember," Elias said as they guided their horses down toward the town, "we're just travelers. You're a young woman coming to file a claim on inherited property. I'm your escort, hired to make sure you get here safely. We're not looking for trouble, just handling legitimate business. Keep that attitude and we'll be fine." They found the hotel easily enough, a 3-story building called the Northern Star, with a sign advertising clean rooms and hot meals. The proprietor was a round-faced woman who smiled warmly as they entered. "We need 2 rooms," Elias said. "One for the lady, one for myself." The woman's smile didn't falter, but Clara saw her eyes take in their trail-dusty clothes, the way Elias positioned himself between Clara and the door. "Of course, sir. How long will you be staying?" "Not sure yet," Elias said. "A few days at least, possibly longer depending on how business goes." "Business at the land office?" the woman asked casually as she produced a ledger for them to sign. "That's right," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "I'm here to file a claim on my late father's mine." "Well, I hope that goes smoothly for you, dear. The land office opens at 8 sharp on Monday mornings. You'll want to be there early. It can get quite crowded." The woman handed them keys. "Rooms 12 and 14, second floor. Dining room serves supper at 6 if you're interested." They thanked her and headed upstairs. Elias checked Clara's room first, looking behind furniture and checking the window before declaring it safe. "Bar the door tonight," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone but me, and make sure it's actually me before you open it. If anything seems wrong, if you hear anything suspicious, fire a shot through the floor. I'll hear it and come running." "You think Doyle could already know we're here?" Clara asked. "I think it's foolish to assume he doesn't have eyes in this town. We're being careful, not paranoid. There's a difference." He moved to the door, then paused. "Try to get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After he left, Clara sat on the edge of the narrow bed and tried to calm her racing heart. They were here. After weeks of planning and healing and preparing, they were actually here in Helena, about to put their plan into motion. By this time tomorrow, either she would have reclaimed her father's mine and set wheels of justice into motion, or everything would have gone terribly wrong. She touched the hidden gun beneath her skirts, taking comfort from its weight. Whatever happened, she wasn't helpless. She wasn't the same woman who'd been left for dead in those woods. That woman had been too trusting, too willing to believe that the law and civilization would protect her. This woman, the one she'd become in Elias's cabin, knew better. This woman was prepared to fight for what was hers, to survive whatever came, to see justice done even if she had to enforce it herself. Clara stood and moved to the window, looking down at the street below. Somewhere in this town, Doyle, Phelps, and Riker were going about their business, secure in their belief that they'd gotten away with theft and murder. They had no idea that their victim was here, healed and armed and planning their downfall. The thought made Clara smile despite her nervousness. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow they would learn that leaving her alive had been their biggest mistake. Tomorrow, the reckoning would begin. She pulled the curtains closed and barred the door as Elias had instructed. Then she lay down on the bed, still fully clothed, the gun within easy reach. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by every creak of the old building, every sound from the street below. But eventually exhaustion won out, and Clara drifted into uneasy dreams of pine forests and justice and a cowboy's gray-blue eyes promising that she wouldn't face her enemies alone. Morning came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Clara woke to early light filtering through the curtains and the sound of the town coming to life below. She washed her face in the basin provided, fixed her hair as best she could with shaking hands, and smoothed down her dress. In the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized herself. Her face was thinner than it had been, marked by fading scars and a hardness around the eyes that hadn't been there before. This was not the proper Boston seamstress who'd arrived in Montana full of naive hope. This was someone else entirely, someone stronger, someone dangerous. A quiet knock at the door made her freeze. "It's me," came Elias's voice. Clara unbarred the door and let him in. He looked rested, alert, ready. He'd cleaned up and shaved and was wearing his gun belt low on his hips. In his hand he carried the leather satchel containing all their documentation. "Ready?" he asked. Clara took a deep breath, touching the hidden gun one more time to assure herself it was there. "Ready. Then let's go claim what's yours." They descended to the lobby where the proprietor wished them good morning and good luck. The streets of Helena were already busy, despite the early hour. Miners heading to claims, merchants opening shops, wagons rumbling past loaded with supplies. It was a prosperous town, Clara thought, a place where fortunes were made and lost on the strength of a good claim and the quality of the ore pulled from the earth. The land office was a solid brick building near the center of town, official and imposing. As they approached, Clara saw several men already gathered outside, waiting for the doors to open. She scanned their faces nervously, but none of them were Doyle or his partners. "Stay close," Elias murmured. "And remember, you have every right to be here. You're not doing anything wrong." At precisely 8 o'clock, a clerk opened the doors and the waiting men filed inside. Clara and Elias went with them, entering a large room lined with filing cabinets and dominated by a long counter where several clerks waited to assist. They took their place in line, Clara clutching the satchel tightly, Elias positioned slightly behind and to her right, where he could watch both her and the door. The line moved slowly as each petitioner presented their business. New claims to file, existing claims to verify, disputes to register. Clara's palms were sweating by the time they reached the counter. A thin clerk with wire-rimmed spectacles looked up at them expectantly. "How may I help you?" he asked in a bored voice. Clara opened the satchel with trembling hands. "I'm here to file a claim on my late father's mining property. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and he passed away 3 months ago. I'm his legal heir, and I have documentation to prove it." The clerk's bored expression shifted to something more interested. "Thomas Whitmore? I remember that claim. There's been some confusion about ownership since his death. Let me see your documents." Clara spread everything on the counter, the will, the deed, the letters, Harrison's attestation. The clerk examined each piece carefully, comparing signatures, checking dates, consulting ledgers. The process seemed to take forever, and Clara was acutely aware of every person who entered the office behind them, every face she didn't recognize who might be one of Doyle's associates. Finally, the clerk looked up. "Everything appears to be in order, Miss Whitmore. Your claim to the property is legitimate. However, I should inform you that there's been another party expressing interest in this same claim. 3 men, Doyle, Phelps, and Riker," Clara said, her voice hard. "I know. They beat me and left me for dead, then stole my original documents and planned to file a false claim. I have witnesses and evidence." The clerk's eyes widened. "That's a serious accusation, miss." It's a serious crime," Clara shot back. and I intend to see them prosecuted for it. Now, can you file my claim or not?" The clerk looked uncertain, glancing between Clara and the documents. "I can file it, yes, but if there's a dispute, it will have to go before a judge." "There won't be any dispute," Elias spoke up, his voice calm but carrying an edge of authority. "Because Miss Whitmore has legal documentation and they don't. Unless they've already filed?" "No, they haven't," the clerk admitted. "They've inquired about the process, but no claim has been submitted yet." "Then there's no problem," Clara said firmly. "File my claim, right now." The clerk nodded and began filling out forms, copying information from Clara's documents. As he worked, Clara felt tension slowly draining from her shoulders. They'd done it. She'd filed her claim before Doyle could file his false one. The first and most important part of their plan had succeeded. But as the clerk handed her the filed claim documentation, as she carefully tucked it back into the satchel, Clara heard something that made her blood run cold. A voice from behind them, loud and angry and all too familiar. "What the hell is this?" Clara turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving toward the gun hidden beneath her skirts. Standing in the doorway of the land office, his face purple with rage and shock, was Doyle. And behind him, looking equally stunned, were Phelps and Riker. For a long, frozen moment, nobody moved. Doyle stared at Clara like he was seeing a ghost, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Then his shock transformed into something darker, something murderous, and his hand dropped toward the gun at his belt. But Elias was faster. In one smooth motion, he'd stepped in front of Clara, his own weapon drawn and leveled at Doyle's chest. "I wouldn't," Elias said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "Not in a room full of witnesses. Not with your hand halfway to your gun. That's how men get shot legally, Doyle. You should know better." The land office had gone completely silent. Every man in the room had frozen, hands hovering near weapons or raised in placating gestures. The clerks behind the counter had taken several steps back, faces pale. This was Montana territory, and everyone recognized the moment before violence erupted, that terrible stillness before blood was spilled. Doyle's hand stayed where it was, halfway to his gun, his eyes locked on Elias's weapon. Clara could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes, weighing his chances, considering his options. Behind him, Phelps and Riker had also stopped moving, smart enough to recognize that their boss had made a mistake. "You," Doyle finally said, his voice choked with rage and disbelief. His eyes shifted to Clara. "You're supposed to be dead." "Funny thing about that," Clara said, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "I didn't cooperate with your plans. Turns out being left for dead isn't the same as actually dying." "I don't know what lies you've been spreading," Doyle started, but Elias cut him off with a sharp gesture of his gun. "Save it for the judge," Elias said. "Right now, you and your friends are going to very slowly, very carefully unbuckle those gun belts and let them drop to the floor. Any sudden moves and I'll assume you're reaching for those weapons, and I'll respond accordingly. Everyone in this room will testify it was self-defense." Doyle's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. "You've got no authority here. Who the hell are you?" "Elias Boone, former Deputy U.S. Marshal, and right now I'm a private citizen witnessing 3 men threatening a woman who has credible testimony that you tried to murder her. So those gun belts, gentlemen, now." The title carried weight even years after Elias had left the badge behind. Clara saw recognition flash across Doyle's face, followed by something that might have been fear. Slowly, deliberately, Doyle unbuckled his gun belt and let it fall to the wooden floor with a heavy thud. Phelps and Riker followed suit, though both looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "Thank you," Elias said, his tone almost pleasant now. He glanced at one of the other men in the office, a burly miner who'd been waiting in line. "You mind picking those up and setting them on the counter? Careful like." The miner nodded and did as asked, clearly relieved to have something to do that broke the terrible tension. With the weapon secured, Elias lowered his own gun slightly, though Clara noticed he kept it ready. "Now," Elias continued, addressing the room at large, "someone want to fetch the sheriff? Tell him Elias Boone needs to speak with him about an attempted murder and land fraud. Tell him it's urgent." 2 men practically ran for the door, eager to escape the confrontation and be useful. The clerk behind the counter had gone white as paper, but he managed to squeak out, "Miss Whitmore's claim has been properly filed. It's legitimate and legal." "Of course it is," Clara said, finding her voice again. The initial shock of seeing Doyle had passed, replaced by something hotter and harder. "Because unlike these men, I have real documentation, not forged papers and stolen property." "You can't prove anything," Doyle snarled, though his confidence was clearly shaken. "It's your word against ours." "My word, supported by legal documents from Boston," Clara corrected. "My word, supported by a witness who found me dying in the woods after you beat me and left me there. My word, which will be backed up by every scar on my face and body. Tell me, Doyle, how are you going to explain those?" "Could have gotten them anywhere," Phelps muttered, but his heart clearly wasn't in it. Clara stepped forward, moving out from behind Elias despite his warning glance. She was done hiding, done being afraid. "Let's be very clear about what happened. 3 weeks ago, you three ambushed me on the trail 5 miles outside town. You demanded I sign over my father's claim. When I refused, Doyle, you hit me multiple times. Then Phelps held my arms while Riker kicked my ribs until I couldn't breathe. You took my documents, my horse, my money, and then you left me in the woods to freeze to death." "Lies," Doyle spat, but there was desperation creeping into his voice now. "Really? Then explain this." Clara turned her head, showing the still visible scar along her temple. "Or this." She pulled back her sleeve, revealing the marks on her wrists where rope had burned skin. "I have a witness who found me that night, who tended my wounds, who can testify to what he saw. Can you say the same? Can you produce any evidence that your claim to my father's mine is legitimate?" The door burst open and Sheriff McCall strode in, a tall man with iron gray hair and a star pinned to his vest. His eyes swept the scene, the drawn weapons, the tense standoff, the scattered gun belts on the counter, and his hand went to his own gun. "Elias Boone," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "Someone better start explaining what the hell is going on in my town." Elias holstered his weapon smoothly. "Hello, Jack. Been a while. I've got a story for you, and you're going to want to hear all of it." Over the next hour, the story came out. They moved to the sheriff's office, where Clara recounted everything: her father's death, her journey to Montana, the attack, Elias's rescue. She showed the sheriff her scars, her documents from Boston, the filed claim from the land office. Elias corroborated her story, describing the condition he'd found her in, the evidence he'd gathered from his visits to the mine, the suspicious expansion of the claim boundaries that Doyle had been planning. Doyle, Phelps, and Riker sat in cells while this happened, shouting denials and accusations. But their protests rang hollow against the weight of Clara's evidence and testimony. Sheriff McCall listened to it all with a grave expression, asking occasional questions, making notes in a worn leather journal. "This is serious business," he said when Clara finished. "Attempted murder, claim jumping, fraud. If even half of what you're saying is true, these men are looking at prison time. Maybe worse." "It's all true," Clara said firmly. "Every word. And I want them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." "There'll be a hearing," McCall said. "Probably in about a week, once the circuit judge comes through. Until then, I'm holding these three in my jail. But I need to warn you, Miss Whitmore, cases like this can go either way. Without physical evidence from the attack itself, without witnesses who saw it happen, it comes down to your word against theirs." "My word and my injuries and my legal documentation against their lies and forged papers," Clara said. "That should be enough." "Should be," McCall agreed. "But juries can be unpredictable, especially when the defendants are white men with established reputations and the plaintiff is a woman from back east. I'm not trying to discourage you, just making sure you understand what you're facing." "I understand," Clara said, though frustration burned in her chest. "I understand that the law isn't always just, but I also understand that I can't let these men get away with what they did. Too many people have let them get away with too much for too long." McCall glanced at Elias, something passing between them, some shared understanding born of years in law enforcement. "You staying in town until the hearing?" "We are," Elias confirmed. "I'll be watching Miss Whitmore's back, and I'll be keeping an eye on anyone who might be inclined to help Doyle and his friends." Good. Because between you and me, I suspect they've got other associates. Men like this usually do. I'll do what I can to protect Miss Whitmore, but my resources are limited. I can protect myself, Clara said, touching the hidden gun beneath her skirts. And I have Elias. We'll be fine. They returned to the Northern Star Hotel as afternoon shadows grew long across Helena's streets. Clara felt exhausted, but also strangely energized. They'd done it, filed the claim, confronted Doyle, gotten him arrested. It was more than she'd dared hope for even a week ago, but as Elias had warned her, this was just the beginning. The real battle would come in the courtroom. That evening, they took dinner in the hotel's dining room, a quiet affair where they spoke in low voices about strategy and next steps. Other diners cast curious glances their way. Word had clearly spread about the confrontation at the land office, but no one approached them directly. McCall's right about one thing, Elias said over coffee. We need to assume Doyle has friends who might try to interfere before the trial. Men who have interest in seeing that claim go to him instead of you. What can they do? Clara asked. The claim is filed. It's legal and legitimate. They can try to intimidate you into dropping it. They can try to bribe officials. They can try to make you disappear before the hearing. Elias's expression was grim. I'm not trying to scare you, just being realistic. We need to be careful. I'm not dropping the claim, Clara said flatly. And I'm not disappearing. I've come too far to back down now. I know, but that means we take precautions. You don't go anywhere alone. We vary our routine so no one can predict where we'll be. We keep weapons close and eyes open. Can you do that? Clara thought about the past 3 weeks, about everything she'd survived and learned and become. I can do that. The question is, can Doyle's friends handle the consequences if they come after me again? Elias smiled at that, a flash of approval in his gray-blue eyes. That's my girl. The words sent an unexpected warmth through Clara's chest. Somewhere over the past weeks, she and Elias had become more than just helper and helped, more than just allies in a dangerous game. They'd become something Clara didn't quite have words for yet. Partners, certainly, but also something deeper. Something that made her feel safe and strong and capable of facing whatever came. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Clara and Elias stayed close to the hotel, venturing out only when necessary and always together. Clara spent hours reviewing her testimony with Elias, preparing for every question a judge or jury might ask. Elias made discreet inquiries around town, gathering information about Doyle's associates and identifying potential threats. On the third day, a lawyer appeared at the hotel. He was a small, neat man named Thornton, who carried a leather briefcase and wore spectacles that constantly slid down his nose. Miss Whitmore, he said, introducing himself in the hotel lobby. I've been following your case with great interest. I wonder if you might spare me a few moments to discuss legal representation. Clara and Elias exchanged glances. They'd discussed finding a lawyer but hadn't acted on it yet, assuming Clara's case was straightforward enough that she could represent herself at the hearing. What kind of representation? Clara asked cautiously. The kind that ensures men like Doyle don't slip through legal loopholes and escape justice, Thornton said bluntly. I've practiced law in Montana for 15 years, Miss Whitmore. I've seen plenty of cases where the facts were clear, but the outcome was unjust because the plaintiff didn't have proper legal counsel. I'd like to make sure that doesn't happen to you. Why? Elias asked, his tone skeptical. What's your interest in this? Thornton adjusted his spectacles and met Elias's gaze squarely. Because Doyle and men like him are a cancer on this territory. They steal, cheat, and murder, all while hiding behind a veneer of respectability. I've watched them do it for years, watched them escape consequences because they had money and connections while their victims had neither. You, Miss Whitmore, have a real chance to take one of them down. I want to help you do it. Clara studied the lawyer carefully. He seemed sincere, and his knowledge of the local legal system would certainly be valuable, but trust was hard-earned after what she'd been through. I can't pay you much, she admitted. Not until the mine is producing again. I'm not asking for payment, Thornton said. Consider this pro bono work, for the satisfaction of seeing justice done. Elias leaned close to Clara and murmured, McCall vouched for him, said Thornton was honest and good at his job. Rare combination in a lawyer. Clara made her decision. All right, Mr. Thornton. I accept your offer. When do we start? Immediately. The hearing is in 4 days, and we have a great deal of work to do. Thornton proved to be worth his weight in gold. Over the following days, he helped Clara organize her testimony, coached her on courtroom procedure, and filed additional motions that put Doyle's defense on the back foot. He also tracked down several miners who'd worked with Clara's father and were willing to testify about Thomas Whitmore's character and his legitimate ownership of the claim. On the morning of the hearing, Clara woke early, her stomach churning with nervousness. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, fixing her hair and practicing her testimony one final time in the mirror. When she went downstairs, she found Elias waiting in the lobby, dressed in a clean shirt and vest, his gun belt buckled low. "Ready?" he asked. "As I'll ever be," Clara replied. The courthouse was packed. Word of the hearing had spread through Helena like wildfire, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to watch. Clara recognized miners, merchants, other prospectors, all curious to see how this case would resolve. She also noticed several hard-looking men scattered through the crowd, men whose eyes tracked her movements with hostile intent. Doyle's associates, she assumed. The judge was a weathered man named Harlan with white hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to opening statements from both sides, Thornton laying out Clara's case with clinical precision, while Doyle's lawyer, a slick man named Pritchard, painted Clara as an opportunistic Easterner trying to steal a claim from hardworking miners. Then the testimony began. Clara took the stand first, Thornton guiding her through her story with carefully crafted questions. She described her father, his letters about the mine, his death, and her decision to come west to claim her inheritance. She described the ambush, every brutal detail, showing the judge and jury her scars as physical evidence. Several women in the courtroom gasped when she revealed the rope burns on her wrists, the still visible bruising on her ribs. "And you're certain it was the defendants who attacked you?" Thornton asked. "Absolutely certain," Clara said firmly. "I saw their faces. I heard their voices. Doyle gave the orders. Phelps held me down. Riker did most of the actual beating. I will remember them for the rest of my life." During cross-examination, Pritchard tried to shake her testimony, suggesting she might be mistaken, that her injuries could have come from a fall or some other accident, that she was simply trying to claim a mine that rightfully belonged to the men who'd been working it. But Clara held firm, answering each question with calm certainty. She'd prepared for this, rehearsed it with Thornton and Elias. She knew her truth, and she wouldn't be swayed from it. Elias testified next, describing the condition he'd found Clara in, the evidence of violence, his professional opinion as a former lawman that this had clearly been an attempted murder. His testimony carried weight. Here was a man with years of experience in law enforcement, someone with no personal stake in the outcome except a desire to see justice done. The jury listened to him with visible respect. The miners who'd known Thomas Whitmore testified that he'd been a good man, a legitimate claim owner, and that Doyle and his partners had been merely hired hands with no ownership stake. Their testimony demolished Doyle's claim that he'd been a partner in the operation. When it was the defense's turn, Pritchard put Doyle on the stand. He presented a very different story, that Clara had never come to Montana while her father was alive, that she'd shown up months after his death trying to claim property she had no real connection to, that any injuries she'd sustained were her own doing in an attempt to frame innocent men. It was a carefully constructed lie, delivered with conviction. But under Thornton's cross-examination, the lies began to crack. Thornton produced records showing that Doyle had inquired about filing a claim on the Whitmore mine less than a week after Thomas Whitmore's death, suspiciously fast for someone who'd supposedly been a legitimate partner. He produced testimony from a land office clerk that Doyle had asked about the process for claiming abandoned property. Most damaging, he got Doyle to admit that he couldn't produce any documentation showing a partnership agreement with Thomas Whitmore. "Because it never existed," Thornton said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "You were hired help, nothing more. And when Thomas Whitmore died, you saw an opportunity to steal what wasn't yours. When his legal heir showed up to claim her rightful property, you tried to murder her. This isn't a claim dispute, Your Honor. This is theft and attempted murder, plain and simple." The defense rested, and Judge Harlan called a recess while the jury deliberated. Clara sat with Elias and Thornton in a small room off the courtroom, too nervous to eat or drink despite Elias's gentle urging. You did well up there, Elias said quietly. You told the truth clearly and stood your ground. That's all you could do. But will it be enough? Clara asked. McCall warned me juries can be unpredictable. They can be, Thornton admitted, but you have facts, evidence, and credible testimony on your side. Doyle has lies and desperation. I think we have a strong case. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. 3 hours that felt like 3 days. Clara wore a path in the small room's floor with her pacing, while Elias watched the door and Thornton reviewed his notes. Finally, a clerk appeared to summon them back to the courtroom. Judge Harlan waited until everyone was seated, then nodded to the jury foreman. Have you reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor, the foreman said, standing. He was a gray-bearded miner with work-roughened hands and an honest face. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of land fraud and theft, we find the defendants guilty. The courtroom erupted. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief, and Elias's hand steadied her elbow. Doyle was shouting denials, his face purple with rage, while Phelps and Riker sat in stunned silence. Judge Harlan banged his gavel, demanding order. The defendants are hereby sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison for attempted murder, to be served concurrently with 10 years for fraud and theft, Judge Harlan declared. The mine claim is confirmed as the sole property of Clara Whitmore, and all expansion claims filed by the defendants are declared null and void. This court is adjourned. As deputies led the 3 men away in chains, Doyle locked eyes with Clara one final time. She saw hatred there, and something else, disbelief that he'd actually faced consequences for his actions. Clara stared back without flinching, without fear. She'd looked death in the face and survived. Doyle's hatred couldn't touch her anymore. Outside the courthouse, Thornton shook her hand firmly. Congratulations, Miss Whitmore. Justice was served today. Thanks to you, Clara said. I couldn't have done this without your help. You would have found a way, Thornton said with a smile. You're a remarkably determined woman. Your father would be proud. As Thornton departed, Clara and Elias stood on the courthouse steps, watching the sun set over Helena. The town was settling into evening, lamps being lit in windows, the day's business concluding. Clara felt exhausted, but also lighter than she had in months, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. We did it, she said softly. It's really over. The legal part is, Elias agreed. Now comes the harder part. Clara looked at him quizzically. What do you mean? Deciding what comes next. You've got your mine back. You can sell it, pay off your father's debts, return to Boston if you want. Or you can stay here, work the claim, build a life in Montana. The choice is yours. Clara gazed out at the mountains, at the vast territory that had nearly killed her, but it also made her stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. She thought about Boston, about the small room she'd rented, the seamstress work that had barely paid for food and rent. She thought about the person she'd been there, small, afraid, trapped by circumstances. Then she thought about the person she'd become here, someone who'd survived violence and cold and betrayal, who'd learned to shoot a gun and fight for what was hers, who'd looked evil in the face and refused to back down, someone who'd found, in the most unlikely of places, a partner who saw her strength and respected it. I'm staying, she said firmly. This is my home now. My father built something here, and I'm going to honor that by building on it. The mine is mine, and I'm going to work it. That's hard work, Elias warned. Mining's not for the faint of heart. Good thing I'm not faint of heart anymore, Clara said with a slight smile. Besides, I was thinking I might need a partner, someone with experience in this territory, someone I can trust, someone who once promised I wouldn't face things alone. Think you know anyone who might be interested? Elias turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression made Clara's breath catch. It was vulnerability, she realized. This hard man who'd seen so much violence and carried so much darkness was looking at her with something close to hope. Clara, he said slowly, are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking if you want to stay, Clara said, meeting his eyes directly. Not just as a partner in the mine, though that too, but as someone who belongs here. With me. If you want that. For a long moment, Elias didn't respond. Then he reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I've been alone for a long time. Told myself I preferred it that way, that I was better off not having ties to places or people. But these past weeks with you, I've remembered what it's like to have something worth fighting for, someone worth protecting, and more than that, someone who can stand beside me and fight her own battles. Is that a yes? Clara asked, her heart hammering. That's a yes, Elias confirmed. To all of it. The mine, the life here, you. If you'll have me. Clara squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes for the first time since that night in the woods. But these were good tears, healing tears. I'll have you, for as long as you'll stay. That might be a very long time, Elias warned with a slight smile. Good, Clara said. I've gotten used to having you around. It would be inconvenient to have to find someone else to teach me to shoot. Elias laughed at that, a genuine sound that Clara realized she'd never heard from him before. It transformed his face, making him look younger, less burdened. I think your shooting lessons are well in hand, but there's plenty else I can teach you about surviving out here. And plenty I can teach you about running a legitimate mining operation, Clara countered. My father's letters had detailed accounts of the business side of things. I know more about ore values and operating costs than you might expect. A partnership, then, Elias said, in every sense of the word. They walked back to the hotel together, still holding hands, planning their future in quiet voices. They'd need to hire workers for the mine, Elias said. Clara would need proper mining clothes and equipment. They'd need to file paperwork making Elias an official partner in the operation. There were 100 practical details to sort through, but underneath the practical talk, there was something else. The recognition that they'd found in each other something rare and precious. Two people who'd been broken by life in different ways, brought together by violence and circumstance, who'd chosen to forge something new from their shared darkness. Over the following months, they made good on their promises. Clara took over management of the mine, proving herself to be as capable at business as her father had been. Elias handled security and operations, using his knowledge of the territory to navigate the complex social landscape of Montana mining. Together, they built something successful and legitimate. The mine produced steadily, not making them rich, but providing a solid, honest living. Clara paid off her father's debts and even managed to save a little. They hired fair workers and treated them well, earning a reputation as good employers. Slowly, carefully, they built a life. On a crisp autumn morning, almost a year after that night in the woods, Clara and Elias stood at the edge of their property, looking out over land that was truly theirs. The mine entrance was visible in the distance, along with the small cabin they'd built nearby, larger than Elias's old place, with room for a family someday, if they wanted one. You kept your promise, Clara said softly, leaning against Elias's side. That first night, you said I wouldn't die alone. You said I wasn't dying at all. And here we are. Elias wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. Here we are, he agreed, still standing, still fighting, still together. Clara thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, frightened, alone, dying in the dark woods. She thought about the journey from that moment to this one, about everything she'd survived and overcome, about the strength she'd discovered in herself and the partnership she'd found with a man who understood darkness, but chose to walk toward light. Thank you, she whispered, for saving me, for staying, for everything. You saved yourself, Elias corrected gently. I just gave you a chance to heal. Everything after that, surviving, fighting back, claiming what was yours, that was all you, Clara. Don't ever forget that. She wouldn't forget. Couldn't forget. Those weeks in the cabin, learning to be strong, planning her revenge, discovering who she really was beneath the proper Boston seamstress exterior, those memories were as much a part of her now as the scars on her skin. But she'd also never forget the sound of Elias's voice cutting through her dying moments, the feel of his arms lifting her from the frozen ground, the steady certainty of his presence through everything that followed. He'd given her more than just rescue. He'd given her a second chance at life, and she'd seized it with both hands. As they walked back toward their cabin, Clara's hand found Elias's, their fingers intertwining naturally. Behind them, the sun climbed higher over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Ahead lay their future, uncertain, challenging, but theirs to shape. They'd been forged in fire and darkness, tested by violence and betrayal. But they'd emerged stronger for it, together in a way that transcended simple partnership or even love. They were survivors who'd refused to let cruelty break them, who'd turned their pain into purpose and their fear into fierce determination. And when Clara looked back years later, when she told their grandchildren the story of how she and Elias had met, she always started it the same way, with a young woman dying in the woods and a cowboy's voice cutting through the darkness, making a promise that changed everything. "You're not dying alone tonight." Those words had been both prophecy and promise, the beginning of everything that mattered. Clara had been left for dead by men who thought her worthless, easily discarded. But she'd been found by a man who saw her worth, who helped her discover her own strength, who stood beside her as she claimed her birthright and built a life she'd never imagined possible. The mine still operated decades later, passed down to their children and eventually their children's children. And every year on the anniversary of that night, Clara and Elias would stand beneath the same pine trees where she'd nearly died, holding hands in the gathering dusk. "You kept your promise," she'd say, the words become ritual over the years. And Elias would smile, pulling her close. "And I always will." What had begun with one man's vow in the darkness had become a lifetime built on courage, justice, and a love strong enough to outlast the wilderness itself. Clara Whitmore had come to Montana seeking only to claim a mine. Instead, she'd found herself, her strength, her purpose, her home. And she'd found a partner who understood that sometimes the greatest battles aren't won with weapons or legal documents, but with the simple refusal to give up, to give in, to let darkness win. She'd been left for dead in the woods, but she'd refused to die. And in that refusal, in that stubborn grip on life, she'd found everything worth living for.